2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
And we're joined by the University of Newcastle's Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes. It's been another wild 7 days. Strap yourself in for the ride of what's going on, especially in federal politics. And very interesting at the moment, it's almost like the Gillard government has sort of bottomed out and they're just coming up a little bit now, but their popularity is not strong, Jim.
Yes, good morning, Dave. It's difficult. At one level, it's been politically relatively quiet as far as the government's concerned. There's not been a lot of controversy. They're fighting what seems to be a losing battle. They're bottomed out. It's hard to know. They seem to have reached the bottom of popularity, but they've
How many points would
back.
they be lagging back behind the coalition?
On a two-party preferred basis, they're about 10 points. So I think it works out at about 55-45.
So if you were to go to an election tomorrow, would you like to go with that 10 points behind you?
Well, no. You certainly wouldn't want to be chasing a 10-point deficit, as it were. However, it remains, it's I think, likely, highly likely, that the government will not be re-elected. However, one of the polls I was looking at earlier today had something of about a 25% uncommitted element in it, which may or may not benefit the government. The curious thing, as we've remarked before, Dave, is that both leaders are unpopular. On a preferred Prime Minister basis, Mr Abbott leads Ms Gillard slightly as the preferred Prime Minister. But when you have a two-party system, if you don't like one, then the other one becomes the preferred outcome, in the same way that if you don't like one particular party on a two-party preferred basis, then by default the second party ends up being more preferred. And in many respects, voters seem to be not very enamoured of either leader, and in fact, the popularity, well, that's a bad way of putting it, David, the support for the Prime Minister is less than those who oppose or would not like to see her as Prime Minister, and similarly the support for Mr Abbott is such that more people would oppose him being Prime Minister than would support him.
Jim, the Prime Minister does
have
her moments, but she did it recently, almost like a politics in the pub or some kind of presentations in a pub in, I think, Victoria.
Yes.
And she got some good support for that, apparently.
Well, the way the couple of news stories I read about that, it went very well for her. There was no fiery debate. People were respectable and respectful, rather, and it went over very well. And it's curious with both leaders, in fact, but more so with the Prime Minister, that when people get to meet her in person and get to interact with her, then they come away with a quite different view. And similarly, I think the same can be said about Mr Abbott. And that sort of would lead me to think, well, how they're projected via the various means which we allegedly get to know them. We see them on television, we hear them on radio, and we think we know who they are because of the image that gets projected, the voices that we hear. And it often turns out that when people meet them in person, they get an entirely different perception, and they actually see the human person rather than the political person as such, even though even in person they're still seeing the political face of that politician.
We're only about 4 or so months away from an election. It's going very quick this year. What would you suggest that the advisors would be saying to the Labor Party?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that one, Dave, because they seem to be very good at kicking own goals at a time when discipline, some cohesion and common purpose would seem to be the order of the day. Yet again, we still find various members within the Parliamentary Labor Party all too willing to push either their own personal agenda or an agenda of interest that they happen to represent or to perhaps be aligned with.
Wouldn't you regroup and try and look at some of the strengths that you've had in the last 4 years, some of the strengths, some of the goals that you have kicked yourself and successes that you've had, look towards emphasising them and where you go to next along those lines?
Well, in a logical and rational universe, that would be the case. But in politics, nothing is ever quite as rational as one would like or as logical. And politics is often largely more about interests and who gets to exercise the power. Now, you would expect that the logical thing to do would be, as you say, to regroup and focus on the strengths.
Yeah.
And for a time there, it looked like the government was able to do that. And for a time, it looked like the opposition was still sufficiently, not in disarray so much, but undecided about its objectives. Now we see that the opposition is far more cohesive. Since the new year, Mr Abbott has begun projecting himself in some quite, shall we say, markedly different ways than he was in previous years. And he's moved away from the no form of opposition to beginning to project a slightly more statesman-like appeal. Now, the question, I guess, particularly in the Labor Party, but also generally, would be, does the leopard change its spots? And that's something that one would have to think carefully about. But at the moment, that level of cohesion in the opposition, they're far more disciplined than they have been in the past. This year, particularly in the past couple of months after the announcement of a definite election date, they've begun to actually align themselves far more cohesively. And I heard Mr Turnbull this morning talking about the team and how things, he's part of a team. He's not a separate performer, etc. And Mr Abbott has done a number of sort of projections, shall we say, and appearances in which the Abbott of old doesn't seem now to be there. In particular, if I can just draw attention to a speech he made in Parliament during the reading of the Indigenous Act that has been debated. And he made an almost Paul Keating-like speech. If you recall, Paul Keating made a very heartfelt speech at Redfern when he was Prime Minister, a very famous speech in which he acknowledged the settler role in dispossessing our Indigenous population. And Tony Abbott, in the Parliament, made a similar sort of speech, not an identical one, but a similar sort of one in which he acknowledged that there needs to be some degree of shall we say, political memory and understanding that the plight of our Indigenous population, of Indigenous people, is not something that's been self-inflicted, that we, as settlers in the country, have some role to play in remedying that. That's a big move from where the opposition were some time ago. It's certainly almost, if you like, surpassing Kevin Rudd's apology. Given Tony Abbott's position of some time back, particularly under the Howard government, that's a major shift. So it sort of signals to me that he's getting some pretty sharp political advice on how to project himself. Having said that, Dave, I also noted that he was also talking about how Anzac Day should not be overshadowed by concerns about Indigenous people, which sort of contradicts what I've just said. But that's as close to a glitch in the opposition rhetoric and political agenda that we've seen for some time. And compared to the Labor Party at present, they're sort of, got their eyes on government. And I think that the message within the coalition is, if we don't put a foot wrong, if we just simply keep going the way we're going, we'll be in government come September 14, the night of September 14. Whereas the Labor Party almost, I think, has got to the point where if some of their actions are read in this particular way, that they seem to be, well, we're going to be beaten on September 14, so what does it matter? And there seems to be a level of, well, it's an impossible task, so let's not bother. Now, it seems to me that it's not over until the votes come in, and there's a long time between now and September. So one would have thought that government advisors, to come back to your original question here, that the advisors will be trying to find ways of keeping the political projection of the government as cohesive as possible, because they do have some positives that they can point to. They do have some things that they can say, these are what we've done since we've been in government since 2010. These are some of the successes. Now, perhaps they're waiting until the budget comes down and then from budget day
Move on from there. Yeah.
try and build the momentum to September 14. Personally, I think, Dave, that's sort of probably leaving it too late. They needed to be cohesive, from day one in 2010, but certainly after the last, the second to last leadership spill, when it was decisive, when Kevin Rudd in fact stood and he was decisively defeated. The last leadership thing, which was a distraction and a waste of time, and just served to undermine the government or the party's credibility as a party of government. And I think that probably did more damage than everything else in many respects, because it simply reaffirmed to the voting population that in some respects the government was a joke, and that the Labor Party couldn't keep its own house in order. How can it keep the parliament in order, let alone the country? So I think that the advisors now have a very tough job, if indeed they can get the Labor Party politicians all heading in the same direction long enough for them to contest the election in a perhaps shall we say, successful way.
It's going to be a weary and interesting path through to September. Thank you, Jim.
Certainly is, Dave.
Joining us and back again with us next Tuesday morning as we look at politics is the University of Newcastle's Dr. Jim Joes. He's an Associate Professor in Politics.